Hello everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and we're up to part 8, I believe, in our series on the quick Ruy Lopez. A series that's so quick I hope to still be alive by the time it's finished. Alright, so this is part 8, as I said. This is the second part on the Berlin Wall Endgame. So the first one was kind of an intro. I was mentioning some of the ideas for both sides, and in particular what each side's pieces can end up doing in these endings. So now we'll start to look at actual variations, and we're going to start with two particular variations. So we'll look at Black's plan with bishop to d7 and king to c8, and accordingly we'll look at White's choice of rook to d1 check to stop this plan. So here we go. This is how we get there. All right, and this is the basic start of the Berlin ending. And the main move here is knight to c3. And as I said, we're going to look at the plan with bishop to d7 followed by king to c8. White can stop this, however, with rook to d1 check. And the drawback of this, though, is that the rook is misplaced ever so slightly on d1. Rather have the a rook on d1 and the f rook perhaps on e1. So after rook to d1 check, Black plays king to e8. Bishop to d7 probably just loses. I think it'll lose to g4. G4, let's say knight e7, e6, f takes e6, knight e5. That's the problem. So for that reason, let me put a blunder sign there. For that reason, Black has to play king to e8 here. And now the main move is knight c3, going back to more common development scheme. There is one interesting game I'll point out, though, and there White played rook to e1. And this was chosen by no less a player than Viswanathan Anand. However, it was in a rapid game against Anatoly Karpov, and I don't think he felt any big need to produce some heavy novelties. Okay, in this position, I think probably the most sensible move for Black is just h6. Preparing bishop to e6. h6 is a normal part of Black's, many Black setups anyway, and it can't be bad here with the free tempo. So this, I think, would be the simplest way to play. In the game, Karpov played knight to e7, and after h3, b6, knight c3, he played bishop to a6, which I don't really care for so much either. After e6 takes and bishop to f4, Anand was slightly better, although the game should have ended in a draw. Karpov blundered in a drawish ending. I mean, one that should have been drawn, but it was a rapid game. He got in time trouble, and went on to lose. But even this is not really so bad for Black. But the simplest response, I think, to this rook e1 business is just h6, and I don't see why Black should have any real regrets here. I would note too, one thing that I pointed out, I think last time, is that if White were to play knight c3, then bishop to b4 is a good move, aiming to just take the knight next move. So this exploits the rook's position on e1 here, and the opposite colored bishop ending, even though there are lots of other pieces, is in fact generally quite good for Black. It's not hard for Black to hold that at all, and you might take a look at a game. I think it's Rebel was the computer, but it might have been an early version of Fritz. Anyway, it's a game Anand played with Black in the Berlin around 1999, maybe even a little bit before that, but I think 99. And he won a long ending against a computer, but it was very easy. So it just took a lot of moves, but the game was decided fairly early on. And it's a great model of just how powerful the Black light squared bishop can be. And it's really surprising, but true, that the opposite colored bishop ending can favor Black in this ending, despite White's having the clean majority and Black's not. All right. Anyway, the point is rook to e1 I think is nothing serious, and it's only been played, I think, just the one time by Anand. All right. The real move is knight to c3, even after rook d1 check. And okay, at this point, bishop to e7 is one of the standard plans for Black. And the idea, or one of the main ideas, is to play knight to h4. And I think that's a plan I neglected to mention last week, but it's one that's become fairly popular. The point is that rather than jumping around with the knight to e7 and g6, or whatever other peregrinations it might undergo later, to simply exchange this and to give Black more space. And part of the pleasure of having a little bit more space is that it becomes easier in turn for black to connect his rooks. So his king has fewer problems, the rooks get connected. Also, if the knight on f3 is exchanged, then black has a much easier time putting his bishop on a good square like e6 or even sometimes f5. So while it's slightly time consuming, it's the advantages are also pretty pleasant for black. And here again, with white having played the slightly, I think, I don't know if I want to say inaccurate, maybe inaccurate, but certainly it's not a particularly testing move with rook to d1 check. This plan, I think, becomes even more effective. All right, white plays h3 here, and I'll show some bits from some recent games. Okay, so a couple of games saw h5, another very standard move. This can be played especially when the knight's not yet, or sorry, when the bishop's not yet on e6, so there's no knight to g5. Although, it's still something that's lurking in the air. So there's always a question when you play h5. I mean, there are some circumstances where it's better than others. The plus, of course, is that it impedes white from playing g4. Sometimes black will even play h4 himself, and even rook to h5 in some cases. All right, white played knight to e2, and now black played bishop to e6. And here, the point for black is that although white can attack the bishop on e6 with knight f4, or putting a knight on d4, or even putting a knight on g5 for that matter, the bishop has squares it can run away to. d5 in some cases, c4, and sometimes it'll just allow the exchange. All right, so let's see some particular cases. I believe this is Caruana against Kramnik. So he played knight e to d4 in Hanty-Mansisk last year. I think that was probably the Olympiad. Black played rook to d8, pinning. Bishop f4, takes, and bishop c8. So we see tactics to the rescue here. This exchange was good. I mean, black got his rook to the d file, which is generally helpful. If black can swap off a pair of rooks, he's generally a bit happier. He didn't end up having to get his light squared bishop exchanged, and I think the position is equal. Here Caruana played e6, and I think I would prefer either bishop to d6 or bishop to f6 to what Kramnik played, but what Kramnik played was fine as well. He just took the pawn on e6, Caruana took on c7, rook d5, okay, and we had this little back and forth, and now knight e6, fe6. And really white has no advantage here, despite the fact that black has this isolated pawn on e6. The reason is that there's no really plausible way to try to win this pawn on e6. So rooks can attack it, rooks can defend it, but the white bishop can't really help with the attack on it. And since that's black's only weakness or nominal weakness, it's really not difficult for black to hold, and indeed he did so without too much difficulty, I think. All right, so going back here, instead of Caruana's knight e to d4, knight f4 has also been tried. And it's been tried many times, and sometimes it's just used as a drawing method. Black plays bishop to c8. And now what does white do? All right. Knight to e2 has been played many times. And, for instance, both Polgar and Motilev courageously forced a draw against Caruana by playing knight to f4 now. Very exciting chess. A more ambitious move was bishop to f4, although any move besides repeating would have been more ambitious. This was chosen by Kamsky against Ni Hua pretty recently. This was from Moscow in 2011. I'm not sure which event that was. But anyway, black played rook to d8, takes, and after b3, Ni Hua played bishop to d5, and I think this position is equal as well. Kamsky got nothing here, takes, c5, and the game was eventually drawn. Okay, one other approach for white, instead of knight to e2, is b3. And this was played in a game Timofeyev against Pashikian, again in Hanty-Mansisk last year. And there black played g5, which is very, looks kind of exciting, but it's in fact entirely good. The knight went back to e2, and now both what Pashikian did and another move here would be good. So I think g4 is just fine, takes, and then playing g3. And black is, I think, in very good shape here. This is equal. In the game, Pashikian played rook to g8, and after a4 played bishop to e6. And this too is equal, and in fact Pishikian went on to win the game. Okay, so it doesn't really seem to me that this whole approach for white with, or after h5, it doesn't really seem to achieve anything with either knight e to d4 or knight to f4. All right, instead of that, knight to h4 has been played as well. And this has done okay too. There was a game, Monokroussos. It's an older game, but it went all right as well. So knight takes, bishop takes, and then, okay, g4 has been played a number of games. And this is actually probably the most testing of the moves. So I wanted to point out knight to e2. This is the older Anand game. And here Krasnikov could have played f5. This is a funny-looking move, but it seems to be reasonably effective. And it gives the black king a little room to run, so that way he can connect the rooks more quickly. But h5 was also fine. And after h5, bishop e3, bishop e7, rook to d2, and now there's that h4 idea. So this is a perfect moment for it. Rook a to d1 and rook to h5. And this has occurred in a number of games. As I said, one was Anand Krasnikov from Vaikanze in 2003, and Anand didn't manage to find anything. And the game was drawn after f4, bishop e6, knight to d4, bishop to c5, and bishop to f2. So black could, if nothing else, swap on d4, and white is not going to break through then. Okay, so as I said though, back here, g4 I think is the more common choice now, and it's not a bad one. Indeed, white's results have been very good here. So after g4, black has generally played the bishop back to e7. White plays king to g2, which is important. I mean, he needs to keep the squares in front of the king well covered. I mean, black is going to play h5, and so to make sure that everything's secure, that the rook can't penetrate, that the pawns are all safe, this is a good move. So h5, f3, bishop e6, and now knight to e2 has been a good score. After rook to d8, white has played bishop to e3, and there haven't been a lot of games with this, but they were high-level games, and white managed to win the majority of them. So I'm not sure that white has anything really all that serious just yet, but it's at least a comfortable position for white. Black's bishops really haven't found their way to activity. The black rooks are not going to connect, and white will often be able to play knight to f4 and have at least chances to swap off that bishop under favorable circumstances. So I think this is perhaps at least a little bit of a pull for white. So this I think would be the way to go, and for that reason then I think that probably this setup with h5, at least at the moment, seems to be a more reliable plan for black. Okay, so that's all I want to say about rook to d1 check. At the moment it seems that black is doing all right, at least in the variation king e8, knight c3, bishop e7, h3, h5. Let's turn now to knight to c3, bishop to d7. And here white has, of course, as always in the Berlin, a multitude of choices. All right, there are plans where you just kind of wait with h3. This is always very useful. There's b3, followed by bishop to b2, and putting the rooks generally on the d file. There's rook to d1. Okay, we've seen this already, but it has its own distinctives here. And there's also bishop to f4, just bringing the piece out. And the use of this, well, I would say it's a little bit less useful than it can be in this case, because if black is going to put his king on c8, then there aren't going to be really any tricks with hitting the c7 pawn. So when the black king goes to e8, bishop to f4, I think, becomes a bit more sensible, because then the possibility of playing e6 and being able to swap off the e pawn for the c pawn to get the e5 square becomes reasonable. Here, that isn't a factor. Anyway, it has been played though, and we'll take a look at that as well. All right, so let's start. We'll begin with b3. Okay, from here, black has played a couple of moves. I mean, king c8 would certainly be the thematic choice, but no less a player than Aronian played bishop to e7 against Magnus Carlsen in the rapid game of their well, they played in Melody Amber in 2008. It's from the rapid game, not the blindfold game. And I think Aronian managed to more or less equalize. Okay, it's similar play to what we saw before. h6, g4, knight h4, takes, h3, h5, f3, bishop e7. But here, White's minor pieces are not as effectively posted as they were in the other example that we looked at a moment ago. And after knight e4, bishop e6, Black seemed to be okay, and went on to win. Although that was just due to a blunder by Carlsen at the end. It was even most of the way, and then Carlsen blundered. Anyway, this seems to be an okay way for Black to handle the position, but the more thematic approach would be the immediate king to c8. All right, bishop to b2 would certainly be normal now, and here h5 is playable, but I'll take a quick look at b6, which was played in the game Shabalov against Hare Krishna, played, I think, in the U.S. earlier this year in Wheeling. That game continued rook a to d1, bishop b7, h3, there's h5 once again, knight e2, aiming to put the knight on d4, and then c5. And this is something that I want to mention. I mentioned it last time as well, but it bears repeating. Black doesn't usually mind playing c5. It's often a very useful move, especially in this setup, freeing c6 for the bishop. But Black wants to do it when White's not ready to play knight to d5 immediately. So when the knight leaves c3, you'll often see it then. White can always bring the knight back to c3 or go to f4 and then put the knight on d5, but at least then he's wasting 2 tempi to do so. All right, Shabalov played rook f to e1, bishop c6, threatening to wreck the white structure. So he went back, and now a5. Okay, and this is a move that I often like in setups where White has played b3. So you're threatening to open up the queen side, and if if White plays a4 to stop this, then sometimes Black can play c4 and either liquidate his doubled pawn or even do some damage to the white structure. So White played a4, and Hare Krishna played king to b7. Okay, Shabalov played c4, stopping the c4 break, but Black was doing very well. And after bishop to g5, g3, rook a to d8, he had no problems in the position. Even though White looks like he's okay with this extra space, in fact, Black has gotten almost everything he wants out of the Berlin. His bishops are both very active. In fact, all of his pieces are very active. He's connected the rooks. The bishop on c6 is a monster. And, in fact, Shabalov got in trouble very quickly here. The threat now is bishop to c2. Maybe Shabalov has to play something like knight to c1 to deal with that. Instead, he played the natural rook to c1, but after rook to d2, he was lost, and the game ended just a few moves later. So you can see he's breaking through on the king side as well. And here he gave up. So the threats, well, there are a bunch of threats. There's bishop takes e2 check, and on rook e2, rook takes a1. He's also threatening knight to g3. So White had to resign here. That was an example with b6. h5 has also been played, but this, I think, maybe leads to some White advantage. So there was a game Caruana against Elyanov from Olginka in 2011, this year. And, okay, actually I think, no, Black could have equalized there. Went knight e4, bishop e7, rook a to d1, a5, a4, c5, threatening c4, so there goes c4. And now, instead of rook a6, when I think White was better, after rook to d3, rook g8, rook f to d1, bishop c6, and knight c3. So you'll notice now the rook on d3 takes care of the threat of bishop takes f3, so the pawns won't be damaged here. Elyanov played g5, but after knight to d5, I think White was slightly better. He did have chances to equalize later on, several chances, but made some mistakes and went on to lose. So even this game is not really terrible for Black, theoretically speaking. But I think instead of rook to a6, maybe bishop to c6 is a better choice. After knight f to g5, rook f8, rook f to e1, Black plays b6, king b7, and so on. And I think he should manage to hold the game. All right, well, not just hold the game, but hold equality. Okay, so the bottom line then, I think, is that b3 probably doesn't promise White an advantage. It's certainly playable, and I'm sure there'll be further developments in the line, but at least as far as recent games are concerned, it seems that black is doing okay. All right, next line, rook to d1. Again, let me point out that black should not play h6, as attractive as it would be. And the reason why it's attractive is that black wants to play king c8, but on knight to g5, playing bishop to e8 looks a bit passive. So that's why h6 would be very natural, but again, it's just a blunder here. g4, knight e7, e6, fe6, knight e5. And the bishop drops, because if he saves it, then he loses the rook to knight f7 check. So h6 is a blunder. All right, king c8 then. Knight to g5, trying to punish black. Bishop to e8. And here white has tried a couple of moves. So there's b3, leaving the knight on its active perch, and there's knight g to e4, rerouting it. If b3, black has played a couple of moves that I think are both good, a5 and b6. And of course, you can end up playing both. So on b6, bishop to b2, bishop to e7, knight g to e4, king to b7. So again, the king runs off to safety, and black manages to challenge the d file before white gets full grip on it. Takes, rook d1, and now another standard move. The king goes back to c8 once the rooks have been exchanged. And from there it covers both d8 and d7, freeing the bishops to go on their merry way. I think this position is equal. This occurred in a game Boligan against Hammer, played in Peristeri in 2010, and black went on to win. So here white got a little too active. He played g4, which I think is an inaccuracy, and then f4. So it looks good, but now we'll see that black, in fact, can get very good counterplay against these advanced white pawns. So sure, white would love to make these pawns run up the board and eventually create a passed pawn and choke black to death, but it's not so simple. h5, h3, takes, bishop to d7, and I think black stands a bit better here. The pawns are just overextended, as I said. Okay, Boligan played knight f2, and here Hammer could have played f6. This would not be bad at all. He played f5, and this is entirely okay too. g5. All right, so this really puts a stop to any of white's ambitions. The problem for black is that it's harder for him to make progress too. So it's probably equal, but the burden I think is on white to maintain the equality. Okay, knight g6, forcing the knight to go passive. Knight f8. This is kind of nice. He improves the position of the knight a little bit. King to g3. Okay, now c5. So he reactivates the light squared bishop. And Boligan is going to be able to put the knight on d5. So that's why I think it's about equal. a5, knight d5, bishop e8. And here a4 was probably inaccurate. But it's a logical move, but he had a bad idea in mind. So after c6, he played knight f6, and he missed a tactical shot. So the idea was this. gf, ef, bishop c7, hitting the f4 pawn, f7, hitting the rook and the bishop. Bishop takes f4 check, and now if the king goes to g2, black has rook to h2 check, and then takes the pawn on f7. So king f3, and now the punchline, bishop f7, bishop h8, bishop h5 check. Oops. Black wins a piece, or ends up a piece ahead, and wins very easily. But anyway, white obviously didn't have to fall for that, but in this position here, black was already doing perfectly fine, and as we saw, g4 followed by f4 only managed to get white in trouble. All right, so that was b3, b6. a5 right away is also possible, and this helps to keep the knight on c3 from running away, because if it goes to e4, then there's a4. So white plays a4, but again, this is a small concession. It's something that black generally likes to have thrown in, this insertion of a5 and a4, because the pawn on a4, well, it's not that it's a target, but it can't be a target, let's say again, if the knight moves, the rook moves to c5 and c4, when, again, either white is forced to allow black to get rid of his doubled pawn, in which case his majority becomes a clean one, or white plays b takes c4, and then the a4 pawn drops. All right, after a4, black played b6, getting on with the usual plan. Bishop to b2, bishop b7, knight g to e4, king b7, rook d3, and again, rook to d8. Black gets to challenge the d file just in time and has no problems. Takes, rook d1, king c8. So business as usual for black. We've seen this. This was Svidler Almashi, again from Hanti Mansisk last year. And after f3, h5, knight e2, bishop d7, king f2, c5, c4, rook e8. Black had no trouble, and in fact, at this point, a draw was quickly agreed by repetition. Knight f4, h4, knight d5, rook e6, and they went back and forth and called it a day. All right. Similarly, instead of b3, white can play knight g to e4. Well, similar in that we've seen this idea before. Of course, not playing b3 makes a significant difference to the queenside structure. I mean, then a5, a4 is, well, it might be played in some cases. It's not really having the same function at all. So black, of course, plays b6, covering c5, and more to the point, preparing both c5 and the king maneuver to b7. White played f3, c5, and this is actually slightly unusual. Again, as I mentioned, black often waits for white to move the knight from c3, but here he's not going to, since he's already put the g knight on e4. On the other hand, black's bishop is on f8, not on e7, so at least knight to d5 isn't threatening to swap off any bishops. That said, I should also point out that black doesn't necessarily mind if that exchange occurs. I already mentioned the idea of bishop to b4 taking on c3, so that's not all that serious either. Anyway, let's see what happens. Knight to d5, king b7, king f2, h6. This prepares bishop to c6, so that way there's no knight to g5 in reply. g4, knight e7, c4. And now kind of a funny move, h5. Of course, when he played h6, the pawn was back on g2. Now this opens the h-file and gives black some counterplay in that way. All right, from here, this has been played, or this was played in a game in Arkiev against Hammer. Here, Hammer played f5, which I think is not best. After this, white obtained some advantage. E takes f6, knight takes d5, c takes d5, bishop g6. So the idea is that his bishops are now very active. In fact, all his pieces are going to activate pretty clearly here, but after bishop f4, not being greedy, and now rook h1, it looks like black is a little bit worse. And in fact, here black had some serious decisions to make. Okay, c takes b3 doesn't work. You can work that out on your own, but white can successfully grab the piece and probably eventually win the ending. In the game, Hammer played bishop to a3, Inarkiev played rook to c2 and was clearly better and went on to win. It took a long time, but he won. I think the best way would have been a5, and then after b takes c4 to play b4. Kind of like a note boom variation. Here I think black has reasonable chances to hold, but he's still a little bit worse. But going back here, instead of f5, and entering that tactical sequence, I think simply knight to g6 would have maintained the balance. f4, rook to d8, and now let's say white plays b3, which certainly makes sense, aiming to support the e5 pawn so he can eventually play f5. So play that, maybe then play king to g2, bishop b2, f5, that would be the plan. But here I think with certainly rook h2 check, but even bishop to c6 or bishop to e7, black should have enough counterplay to be all right. One problem for white is that it's hard for him to keep everything really under control. He can put his king on g2, but all right, if he does that, then one idea for black, well, okay, let me take a step back here. Okay, black has a number of targets. All right, the rook can come to h2. f4 is also a little bit of a target. And if, let's say the white bishop goes to b2, then c6, and the f4 pawn would then hang, or potentially hang. The g4 pawn could be a slight target. Black could play rook to h4 or bishop to d7. And if white plays g5, well, then there will be a blockade. If he plays f5, then the e5 pawn might hang. So there are a number of ways in which black can kind of take his whacks at white's kingside. So white's position looks more attractive, but in fact he doesn't seem to have an objective advantage here. So I think then that black can hold his own here too, although this seems to be the most dangerous of the lines that we've seen so far from black's point of view. All right, so that was rook to d1. Next up, bishop to f4. And this, I think, is just a little too straightforward. And again, with the king being on c8, there's no real danger to the c7 pawn. So king c8, knight to g5. And here, once again, a game of Hammers from Peristeri in 2010. I think he found a very interesting idea here. He played h6. Rather than bothering to defend the f-pawn, he just gives it up, and the knight on f7 will end up trapped. All right, well, white could play e6 and sack the pawn to get the knight out, but that would be a very good exchange for black. Black's pieces would come to life. So Knightic, a very strong grandmaster, played rook a to d1. Of course, the bishop can't move because rook to d8 is mate. So bishop to b4, knight e4, and now bishop to e6. And after g4, knight h4, bishop g3, knight to g6, rook d4, bishop e7. Okay, white has made all of his little threatening moves, but now the knight is trapped, and it's just a matter of how he wants to lose it. I think white has reasonable compensation in a couple of lines, but probably black is at least equal, and certainly this line is nothing for black to fear. So one way to go is knight takes h6, and then h3, followed by f4. I think black is a little bit better there, but nothing too serious. In the game, Knightic played knight f to d6 check. Okay, takes, knight takes d6, king c7, again f4. But after c5, I believe black is slightly better. The game continued rook to e4, bishop d5, rook e3, takes, takes. Of course, not king takes d6 now because of f5 discovered check, but king c6, f5, knight f8. And black managed to achieve a nice blockade. So here, the d-pawn is blockaded, the bishop on d5 is fantastic, the bishop on g3 is not fantastic, and gradually, although not that gradually, Hammer was able to improve his position and went on to win. In fact, just a few moves later, I think he's already winning. Yeah, here I think he's winning. So now the rooks get into the game, and it should be the end. All right, so bishop to f4 I think is really not a serious move, and Hammer's idea I think is very nice with h6. All right, finally h3. Very flexible approach and the main move. All right, here black can play either h6 or b6, and b6 just gets on with the plan. But the point of h6, of course, is we stop knight to g5. Anyway, here we'll look at three moves, none of which is knight to g5. So we'll look at bishop to f4, and again, I'm not generally terribly impressed by this plan, although it's not horrible. And indeed, it was played by a very, very strong player, by Vasyl Lagrave, against Magnus Carlsen earlier this year in Wijk aan Zee. There's also rook to d1. So again, we see the wrong rook going there. And then finally b3. All right, so let's start with bishop to f4. So this was played, as I said, by Vasyl Lagrave against Carlsen in Wijk aan Zee earlier this year. And continued like this. King c8, rook a to d1, h6, bishop h2, getting out of the way, for the f-pawn later on. a5, g4, knight e7, knight to d4, and again, when the pawn's on g4, it's often quite appropriate for black to switch gears and play h5. Well, here, I've said before that one of the ideas of bishop to f4 is to play e6, and said, well, but if the king's on c8, it doesn't really make much sense. But he plays e6 anyway, and the reason is that he's going to try to regain the pawn. Takes, and rook f to e1. But now we see another point of h5. After hg, hg, black has rook to h6, and the rook protects it. This position is equal, and in fact, in the game, I would say equality was maintained more or less from start to finish. So you could look at the game. It should be easy to find in an online database. So it was an interesting game. Certainly, white can play in this way, but objectively, I think black was all right throughout. All right, so that's bishop to f4. Next up, rook to d1. Okay, king c8, getting out of the way. Now there's no e6, knight e5 tricks. g4, knight e7, knight to g5. And, all right, bishop to e8 is obvious and not bad. But as you probably would imagine by now, since this is one of Hammer's games, he plays f5, so he finds a different approach. Now, White could go jumping in with knight f7, and then play rook to e1 to play e6. And the point is that if bishop to e6, knight to g5, forks e6 and h7. So king to b7, e6, bishop e6, let's say a4, a5, rook d1, and now g5. Very unclear position, but black seems to be all right. And one idea of g5 is to lift the rook to g6 to kick the props out from this, well, to hit the pawn on e6 and to knock the props out of the knight on f7. Notice, too, that knight takes f7 or bishop takes f7 is not so good. Well, bishop g5 would just be a blunder because if bishop takes f7, actually maybe it's not a blunder, but because he has bishop takes e7 back, but at the very least black regains his material. While on knight takes g5, black can play f takes g4, hg4, h6, and then take on g4. All right, so that was knight to f7 here. In the game, e6 was played. Bishop to e8, knight f7, which I would just say is not the only move, but it's an okay move. Here Hammer traded, played knight to g6, which was good. G takes f5. Here Hammer played knight to h4, and this might be good enough for equality. I think in this position it was equal, and indeed he went on a draw against Navarra in Vaikanze earlier this year. But it may just be simpler after g takes f5 to play knight e5 and then collect the f7 pawn directly. In either case, black has no problems. So rook to d1 was no big deal either. Okay, next up, b3. The most, I think, straightforward approach. And this one did lead to a win against Hammer. All right, king to c8. And, all right, at this point, a couple of moves. So there's, again, rook to d1, and there's bishop to b2. Rook to d1 was played by Ivanchuk against Hammer and Peristeri in 2010. So that same event. But I think black was equal for much of the way, and he just got ground down by Ivanchuk's better technique. After bishop to e7, bishop g5, h6, takes, king h2. The point of king h2, which you'll sometimes see, is to play g4 and then to meet h5 with king to g3, keeping all the pawns together. So c5, knight d5, takes, bishop c6, rook to d2, king to b7, and I think this position is roughly equal. Again, Ivanchuk showed superior technique and did go on to win the game, but at this point I don't think there are any really serious problems for black. So I'll mention just a number of improvements quickly here. So the game went to this point. Okay, I like a5 maybe a little bit better than rook h to g8. But okay, even here he played a5, which is all right. He could have played rook to d8 or h5. This is also interesting. And yeah, I would say that part of what I don't like about the way Hammer handled this ending is that he waited for a very, very long time to play a takes b3. In fact, he never played it. And I think that would have made good sense to play that and then swing a rook over to a8 in many cases. I think that would have given him some better chances to drum up some play in this ending. So, as I said, definitely some inaccuracies, and even till very near the end, he should have been okay. So he just blundered near the time control and went on to lose. All right, so rook to d1, it's certainly not bad, but it's not the end of the world by any means. And not only that, but I mean, bishop to e7 is not the only choice. I mean, black could play h6, he could play a5. There are many reasonable moves here. Let's look then at bishop to b2. And this was chosen by Jan Smeets against Carlsen earlier this year in Vaikanze 2011. There, Carlsen played the immediate h5. And again, this makes some sense with the bishop gone from c1. So he can put his bishop on e7 and not have to deal with bishop to g5. So again, going back to the Ivanchuk-Hammer game, I'm not sure that I really am a big fan of this rook to d1, or meeting rook to d1 by bishop to e7. So I prefer not to allow that exchange if I don't have to. So bishop to b2, h5, g3, bishop to e7, rook a to d1, a5, a4, rook e8, rook to d3, c5. All right, again, it allows the immediate knight to d5. But here, black is very well set up for it. After knight to d5, c4. So I've mentioned this trick a number of times, and now finally we see it in action. And here, in fact, black is already better. Okay, Smates played rook to c3. This must have been what he thought he had, since on c takes b3, then c7 falls. But there are neat little tricks here. Bishop to c5. And now, if rook takes c4, there's knight takes g3. That's the problem. So he plays king to h2, bishop to c6. And now what? Well, if the knight retreats, then what happens? Well, then bishop to b4, and the knight on f3 is going to hang. So he played b takes c4, Carlsen played bishop takes a4, and now he just stands better with no drawbacks in his position whatsoever, and he went on to win pretty easily in this game. So I'll just show the rest of it quickly. Okay, bishop c6. Here he played rook to f1, which is also a mistake. And now the a pawn starts to move. Rook a5. And the problem, I mean, white has lots of problems. I mean, c4 is weak, the e5 pawn is weak, his bishop is bad, and you'll see there are just tactical problems for him everywhere. So he played g4, trying to lash out and gain some space, but this creates new problems. Takes, knight e7, knight to b4, and in this position, black is winning. King g3, knight g6, and what is white going to do about the e5 pawn? He plays rook e1, but now takes, and rook e5. The rook on e1 is loose, so white doesn't have the chance to play rook takes f7. If he trades, then knight takes e5, and f7 is protected. Black is therefore up a pawn for absolutely nothing at this point, and more food is to come. Rook e4, rook f7, rook g4, still up a pawn, and here white just resigned. Part of the problem is that he's in this terrible pin with the knight and the bishop there, but his c-pawns are also weak. Knight to d6 is coming, and then c4 drops, so it's horrible here. Okay, so that then is not quite the end of the story, but it is the end of the b6 story on move 10. Now we have h6. Okay, this, as we've pointed out numerous times, takes g5 away from white's pieces, but we did see that, in fact, it's not so terrifying if white plays knight to g5 in any case. All right, b3, king c8 is the usual move, but c5 has been played as well, and black has had some up and down results with this move. Generally speaking, his results have been a little bit poor, although perhaps it's still good enough to equalize. All right, 3 games we'll take a look at least part of. One was with rook to d1. This was Kamsky against Zhu Jinchao, played in Moscow earlier this year. It was a long draw. Black was all right there. King c8, knight to d5, and now g5. This, of course, grabs space. It gives up the f6 square, but it allows the fianchetto, and again stops white from using the f4 square, or at least doesn't make it easy for white to use that square. c4, bishop e6, bishop b2, b6, g4, knight e7, king g2, and then knight to g6. Okay, king g3, bishop g7, knight f6, king b7. And, all right, the advantage for black of this g5 approach is that now the rooks are connected. Okay, he is giving up some space. The knight on f6 is not bad, but black is all right, and indeed went on to draw a long game. Back to c5. Instead of rook to d1, another move that's been chosen is bishop to b2, which is a very obvious and natural move. This is a game Shirov-Karyakin played in Odessa in 2010, and Shirov went on to win the game, although I think black could have maintained equality later. Karyakin played the very direct knight to d4. They swapped, knight to d5, c5, f4. Here I think black has several good moves. Bishop to f5 hitting the c2 pawn, bishop e6 hitting the knight, and bishop to c6 as played I think are all okay. Shirov played c4, which is forced, and now Karyakin enters a very forcing sequence that I think is okay, but he errs at the end of it. D takes c3, bishop c3, bishop takes d5, rook a to d1, king c7, rook d5, bishop e7, rook f to d1. And here, Karyakin played king to c6, getting out of the rook to d7 check fork. Shirov played e6, and this was a favorable transformation of the position for Shirov. If black takes, white takes on g7, and the pawn structure, well, he plays rook to d7 first, and he's going to take on g7 sooner or later, and that will be a favorable transformation of the pawn structure for him. While if the pawn advances to f6, then this pawn on e6 is very good. White cements it with f5, and black is in trouble. And as I said, Shirov went on to win. But he should have played rook h to d8, and now I think black is just fine. For instance, if we have this big exchange and then white plays e6, the simplest approach for black is to play bishop to f8, not creating any further weaknesses. And after e takes f7, king e7, king f7, and black will hold this without any real difficulty. White gets a slightly more active king, but it would be very surprising if that's enough to win. Though I suppose it could be examined further. So maybe there is something to this. Certainly, I think white is a little bit more comfortable here, but I would be, again, very surprised if this is enough for white to win. So he will create a passed pawn, but getting any further than that, I'm not sure. All right, well, this does need to be examined further, so I might be a little bit hasty in just labeling this a dead position. So I think white does have a little bit of a pull here. I don't think it's too serious, but it's not nothing. Let's go back then. So perhaps here, maybe bishop to e6 or bishop to f5 should be examined further. Okay. Next move to look at is knight to d5, and this was chosen by Karyakin himself against Kramnik earlier this year in the final Melody Amber tournament. Kramnik played c6, which is often a bit of a iffy move. I mean, black generally doesn't want to play this, in part because it takes c6 away from his bishop, and it also slightly weakens the d6 square. Although this is not a position where that's likely to be relevant in a hurry. Knight f4, g5. And here maybe knight h5 with the standard idea of putting the knight on f6 sooner or later is probably good enough for a very small pull. In the game, Karyakin played bishop to b2, which was interesting. And here I think Kramnik can just take. e6 and rook to g8 is okay, but also bishop to g7 is just fine. Takes, 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 knight e5, king e7, rook f to e1, knight e6. White certainly has full compensation for the pawn here. Black's pawn structure is not the greatest in chess history, but it's not that bad either. And I think black should be able to hold the balance here without too terribly much difficulty. In the game, instead of biting with g takes f4, Kramnik played rook to g8. Again, I think knight h5 is good for an edge for white. Karyakin chose e6, and while he has adequate compensation for the pawn, I don't think he had an advantage. But it was an easier position for white to play, certainly, and white did go on to win here, although I'm not sure he's better at this point. This said, I still don't really like c5 so much. I think it would be better to play king c8. And this was played by Nakamura against Anand earlier this year. Or sorry, not quite. It was late last year in the London tournament. And that game went like this. Bishop to b2, b6, rook a to d1, knight e7. So the classic knight remaneuver, although we haven't seen it yet today in the rest of this video. Rook f to e1, c5. Now knight to d5 is no big deal because black can simply swap it off and then put his bishop on c6 or e6. Knight e2, knight to g6, taking f4 away from the knight. h4 to drive the knight away so the knight can get to f4. Here, black could consider bishop to g4, but it looks like knight h2, steadfastly insisting on this plan, probably gives white an edge. Bishop f5, h5, knight e7, and then c4, followed eventually by moving the knight to take over the d5 square. So I think white's a little bit better there. So I would approve of Nakamura's bishop to e7. And now Anand played, interestingly, with e6. Takes, and now not the immediate bishop to g7, because after rook to g8, there might be some problems. Or actually, you can just play rook to h7 and then take on h4. So that's even simpler. I was thinking of rook to g8 and trying to stir up some trouble on the g file, and that's probably okay too, but rook h7 is much simpler. So h5 is forced, knight h4, knight f4, takes, bishop to d6, takes, rook f8. And this was a good move. Bishop takes g7, rook f5. Anand traded rooks and took this pawn. And after rook h5, we have an interesting ending. It's objectively drawn, and indeed the game was drawn. Anand tried every trick he could think of, but Black was able to hold. And I think, objectively speaking, it is a draw. You should take a look at the game. It's a very long game. It went another 48 moves. As I said, though, objectively speaking, I think Black can hold here. But White is at least pressing, so it's at least a slightly uncomfortable position for Black. So after b3, I think c5 is probably okay for Black, but he has some problems to solve there. And likewise, king c8. Anand, I think, found a nice plan that was able to that he was able to use to cause some trouble. Okay, there are certainly alternatives for both sides in this. I haven't even looked at the historical main line in this position with rook to d2. So this is also a very common approach. Against this, Black plays c5, rook f to d1, bishop e6, knight e2, g5, rook checks, king over, takes, h4, g4, and there's a lot of theory on this as well. Knight to h2, okay, Black I think generally plays h5, rook to d8 check, king goes to b7, and so on. And I think I discussed this position, in fact, in the old video that I did, The Exciting Berlin. I think Black has good chances to equalize here. Anyway, you can examine that for further details. So this video's already gone on quite a long time, but hopefully you've seen enough that you have a pretty good sense of what the standard plans are for both sides, and hopefully some of you will take up this king to c8 approach. But who knows? You can play as you like. Hopefully, though, you found this useful to, for both sides. So if you play against the Berlin, you'll have some ideas certainly too on how to create some pressure against this plan. All right, thanks a lot. I'll see you next time. I'm not sure if we'll proceed directly with the Berlin or maybe do a different show, but certainly we're going to make some progress on this and move on to other Ruys. But this is a very rich and fascinating system, and it's a good way for Black to play for a win. Again, many players with White feel very uncomfortable with all of this flexibility. I mean, there's no direct plan. There are very few lines where White gets anything even remotely resembling an attack. So it's, as I said, it's a nice way to frustrate many White e4 players. Okay, see you next time. Bye-bye.